The first lie Americans were taught was that the land was empty. Long before highways cut the plains into straight lines, before railroads screamed across valleys, before flags were planted and renamed rivers, the land already knew its people. It remembered their footsteps, their prayers, their dead. It remembered names that were never written down, languages never taught in schools, and laws that did not need paper to exist. On a cold morning in the winter of 1804, the land watched again as strangers arrived. They came with journals and compasses, rifles slung across their shoulders, flags folded carefully in leather cases. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark called it an expedition. History would call it exploration. But to the nations who lived there, it was something else entirely. It was the beginning of a long forgetting. Lewis stood at the edge of the Missouri River, breath fogging in the air, staring west as if the horizon itself had been waiting for him. In his journal, he would later write of vast, unclaimed territory. He did not write about the Mandan villages nearby, their earth lodges warm with fires, their granaries full, their trade networks stretching hundreds of miles. He did not write about the children who watched silently from the trees, or the elders who already understood what maps meant. Maps meant hunger. Maps meant soldiers. Maps meant death. Thomas Jefferson had sent Lewis and Clark west not only to chart rivers and mountains, but to assess native tribes, how many they were, how strong they were, whether they could be controlled. Jefferson believed Native Americans were intellectually equal to whites, but culturally inferior. He believed they could be civilized, and if not, removed. Removal was a polite word. It always was. For the Mandan, the Hidatsa, the Arikara, and dozens of other nations along the river, the expedition was a warning disguised as curiosity. The strangers asked questions. They measured land. They handed out medals stamped with the face of a distant president. They spoke of friendship. Friendship did not last long. By the time the United States turned 50 years old, it had already decided something fundamental. This continent would belong to one people, one language, one idea of progress. Everything else would have to disappear. In Washington, politicians spoke of destiny as if it were ordained by God. Newspapers printed illustrations of settlers moving westward, angels floating above them, native people fading into shadows behind. Painters called it manifest destiny. They painted wagons glowing with divine light. They did not paint the bodies left behind. In 1810, Tecumseh understood what most American leaders pretended not to see. Tecumseh was Shawnee, tall and intense, his voice steady even when speaking to enemies. He believed the land belonged to all native nations collectively, not to individual tribes who could sell it piece by piece. He traveled thousands of miles, urging unity. Sell a country? He asked. Why not sell the air, the clouds, the great sea? The United States labeled him a threat. When Tecumseh allied with the British during the War of 1812, it sealed his fate. After his death in battle, his Confederacy collapsed. The dream of native unity died with him, and America learned a lesson. Divided tribes were easier to destroy. Disease arrived before soldiers did. Smallpox did not need treaties or muskets. It moved invisibly, carried on blankets, breath, trade goods. Entire villages vanished within weeks. Elders died before passing on stories. Children were left with no words for the world. Some American officials knew exactly what they were doing. In letters, Army officers discussed distributing infected blankets during conflicts. Whether through intent or indifference, the result was the same. By the early 1800s, native populations had already collapsed by more than half. Still, they survived. They adapted. They negotiated. They trusted words written on paper. That trust would cost them everything. Andrew Jackson did not see native nations as people. He saw them as problems. As a general, he had built his reputation fighting the Creek Nation, burning villages, executing prisoners. As president, he turned that brutality into law. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 passed narrowly through Congress. Supporters called it necessary. Opponents called it immoral. Jackson signed it anyway. The law gave the president power to negotiate land exchanges. In practice, it gave the Army permission to force people from their homes. The Cherokee Nation believed American law would protect them. They had schools, newspapers, a written constitution. Many spoke English. Some had fought alongside American forces in previous wars. When gold was discovered on Cherokee land in Georgia, none of that mattered. White settlers flooded in, backed by state militias. The Cherokee appealed to the Supreme Court, and for one brief moment, the law sided with them. It did not save them. The roundups began in 1838. Families were dragged from their homes. Mothers were separated from children. Elderly people were forced to march or left to die. Soldiers looted houses and burned what they did not take. Winter came early. The Cherokee walked west through snow and mud, coughing blood, burying loved ones by the roadside. Some sang funeral songs every night. Some stopped speaking altogether. By the time they reached Indian Territory, 1 in 4 was dead. The Choctaw called it a trail of tears and death. History shortened it to something almost poetic. Nothing about it was poetry. West of the Mississippi, the government promised peace. Then it broke that promise too. As railroads cut across the plains, buffalo herds were slaughtered by the millions. Hunters shot them from trains for sport. The Army encouraged it. Without buffalo, plains tribes would starve. They did. Reservations were established on land no one else wanted. Food rations were controlled. Corruption was rampant. Hunger became a weapon. When native people resisted, the Army responded with overwhelming force. At Sand Creek, soldiers attacked a peaceful camp under a white flag. At Bear River, bodies froze in the snow. At Wounded Knee, machine guns ended centuries of resistance in minutes. Medals of honor were awarded. They have never been revoked. By the end of the 19th century, the war changed form. Now the target was the mind. Native children were taken to boarding schools. Their hair was cut. Their names were erased. Their languages were beaten out of them. Graves filled quietly behind school buildings. "Kill the Indian, save the man," the administrators said. What they really meant was, kill the memory. But memory did not die. It hid in songs, in ceremonies outlawed but practiced anyway, in names whispered to children at night. The land remembered too. It remembered the blood. It remembered the lies. It remembered who had been here first. And it waited. The treaties were always written in a language most native leaders could not read. Even when translated, the words meant something else to the men who signed them. To native nations, a treaty was a sacred bond, a promise witnessed by ancestors and land alike. To the United States government, a treaty was a temporary inconvenience, valid only until it conflicted with expansion. Between 1787 and 1871, the United States signed hundreds of treaties with native nations. Each one carried the same quiet lie that the land being reserved would remain native land forever. Forever, it turned out, was negotiable. In the council rooms where treaties were negotiated, American officials often arrived with gifts, cloth, tools, whiskey. They spoke of friendship and protection. They warned of threats from other tribes, other settlers, other empires. They framed land cessions as necessary compromises. Behind them stood the army. Some native leaders signed because they believed it would save their people. Others signed because starvation had already begun. Some refused entirely and watched their villages burn anyway. Consent under the shadow of a rifle was not consent at all. The Lakota Sioux learned this lesson again and again. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 recognized Lakota control over vast territory, including the Black Hills, land sacred beyond measure. The treaty promised that no white settlers would enter without permission. For a time, the promise held. Then gold was discovered. Prospectors flooded into the Black Hills, tearing up hillsides, poisoning rivers, building towns overnight. The Lakota protested. The government responded not by removing the miners, but by offering to buy the land. The Lakota refused, so the government declared them hostile. The war that followed was framed in newspapers as savage uprisings against civilization. What it actually was, a campaign to force compliance. General George Armstrong Custer became the face of that campaign. He was young, ambitious, reckless. He wanted glory. He found death instead at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors defeated his forces in a rare and stunning victory. America did not forgive that humiliation. The response was swift and brutal. The Army intensified its efforts. Winter campaigns targeted villages when families were most vulnerable. Food supplies were destroyed, horses were killed, entire bands surrendered simply to survive. Within a few years, the Lakota were confined to reservations. The Black Hills were seized anyway. The Supreme Court would later rule the seizure illegal. The compensation offered, money, was refused. The Lakota wanted their land back. They still do. While wars raged in the West, another form of violence unfolded quietly in the East. Assimilation became policy. The Dawes Act of 1887 divided communal tribal lands into individual plots. Any surplus land was sold to white settlers. The idea was to turn native people into farmers, private landowners, Americans. The result was catastrophic. Within decades, native nations lost millions of acres. Tribal governance structures collapsed. Poverty deepened. The land base that had sustained communities for generations was shattered into fragments. This was not accidental. One senator described the goal clearly: to get rid of the tribal mass. And it worked. Children paid the highest price. Federal agents arrived at reservations with orders. Parents were threatened with imprisonment if they resisted. Children were taken hundreds of miles away to boarding schools designed to erase their identity. At Carlisle, at Chilocco, at dozens of other institutions, children were remade. They woke to bells. They marched in lines. They prayed in a language that was not theirs. Those who ran away were hunted down. Those who fell ill often did not return. Letters home were censored or never sent. Parents sometimes waited years without knowing whether their children were alive. Many were not. Grave markers at these schools still bear names, often misspelled, or simply numbers. By the early 20th century, Americans congratulated themselves. The frontier was closed, the Indian Wars were over, progress had triumphed. Native people were still there, of course, but they were no longer seen. They were poor, they were confined, they were ignored. In 1924, Congress granted U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans. It was framed as inclusion. It did not come with full rights. Many states still barred Native people from voting for decades. Citizenship did not restore land. It did not restore language. It did not restore the dead. Yet, survival persisted.
In ceremonies held in secret, in stories passed down despite punishment, in quiet resistance that did not make headlines. During World War II, thousands of Native Americans served in the U.S. military. Navajo code talkers used their language to transmit unbreakable codes. A language once forbidden in schools became a weapon that helped win a war. America praised them, briefly. After the war, Native veterans returned to reservations still lacking basic infrastructure. Promises of opportunity faded again. The 1950s brought a new threat: termination. The government decided some tribes should cease to exist legally. Federal recognition was withdrawn. Lands were sold. Services were cut. Once again, the language was polite. The impact was devastating. Native activism rose in response. In 1969, activists occupied Alcatraz Island, claiming unused federal land under treaty rights. The occupation lasted 19 months. It captured national attention. It forced Americans to look, briefly, at what they had tried to forget. Other protests followed. Wounded Knee again. This time not a massacre, but a standoff. History echoed. By the late 20th century, the word genocide began to appear, hesitantly, in academic circles. The United Nations defined it clearly: acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. The United States met that definition. Through killing, through forced removal, through starvation, through cultural destruction, through the taking of children. Still, the word remained uncomfortable. It challenged the national story. Today, Native nations continue to fight for sovereignty, land rights, clean water, and the preservation of language and culture. They do so in a country built on their dispossession. The land remembers. It remembers villages beneath cities. It remembers trails beneath highways. It remembers bones beneath fields. The story did not end with conquest. It continues in courtrooms, in classrooms, in ceremonies held at dawn. And it waits to be told fully.
History rarely remembers names. It remembers dates, laws, wars, and the men who claimed victory. But the people who disappeared, the ones who never signed treaties, never commanded armies, slipped quietly out of the record. They lived, they suffered, they watched their world collapse, and most of them were never written down. In the summer of 1874, the sun rose over Navajo land as it always had. Red sandstone cliffs caught the morning light. Sheep moved slowly across the dry earth. Children played near the hogans, unaware that this ordinary morning marked the end of everything they knew. The United States Army called what followed the Long Walk. The Navajo called it Weldi, the place of suffering. Kit Carson was a hero to America, a scout, a soldier, a man of the frontier. He was sent to pacify the Navajo. His orders were simple and ruthless: destroy crops, poison wells, burn homes, kill livestock. It was not a battle plan, it was starvation. By winter, the Navajo had nothing left. With no food and no shelter, they surrendered. Then they were forced to walk. Thousands of people, elders, women, children, were marched hundreds of miles to Bosque Redondo, a barren reservation camp. Those who fell behind were beaten or shot. Those who collapsed were left where they fell. When they arrived, they found poisoned water, infertile land, and disease. Hunger followed them there. So did death. 4 years later, the Navajo were allowed to return home. They returned alive, but their world was gone. Not every nation was allowed to return. In California, genocide was not hidden, it was funded. The state government paid militias to hunt Native people. Bounties were offered. Entire villages were wiped out. Men, women, children, no distinction was made. Between 1846 and 1873, California's Native population was nearly annihilated. It was not called war, it was not called murder, it was called necessary. There was a girl whose name history never recorded. She belonged to the Yuki people. She was 8 years old when her family was killed. She ran into the forest and survived alone for weeks, hungry, silent, terrified. Eventually, settlers found her. She was taken to a farm and forced to work. Her language was forbidden. Her name was replaced with an English one. She grew up in a society that denied her people ever existed. Her story was never written, but there were thousands like hers. On paper, the United States has never officially admitted to genocide, but the documents speak.
Military reports describe villages neutralized. Letters mention children removed. Budget records list reduced food rations. These were not isolated incidents. They were systems. They were policy. In the 1930s, for a brief moment, the policy shifted. The Indian Reorganization Act attempted to restore tribal governments. Some land was returned. Some languages survived. But the damage was already deep. Poverty, alcoholism, suicide. These were labeled social problems. Their cause was rarely named. In the 1970s, Native voices rose again. The American Indian Movement, Alcatraz, Wounded Knee. This time there were cameras. America was forced to look. Briefly. Some changes followed. Many did not. Today, Native nations continue to fight. For clean water, for sacred land, for sovereignty. The Dakota Access Pipeline, court battles, protests in freezing winds. The law exists. Justice moves slowly. There was an old Navajo woman. She used to say, "We did not lose because we are still here." She taught her granddaughter the language, the songs, the names that do not appear on maps. She knew that stories were the final weapon. The land still remembers. It remembers footsteps. It remembers cries. It remembers resistance. This story is not the past. It is the present. It is ongoing. And as long as someone listens, it does not end.